all you heroes, hawks, heralds, crows, pirates, and wardens. Welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we unpack, discuss, and galaxy brain about all the lore behind the Dragon Age series.
We are so excited to bring you this podcast. Every episode, we'll be talking about a different topic in the Dragon Age universe, from character deep dives to exalted marches and elven gods. We will cover it all.
There will be spoilers. And always remember, swooping is bad.
Hello and welcome to the Dragon Age Lorecast, where we talk about Dragon Age and its lore. I'm one of your hosts, Austin, also known as Teacup, and I am here with my amazing, immaculate, divine co-host.
Okay, can you start that over because I'm uncomfortable?
No, that's silly. Just introduce yourself.
Okay, well, I'm Shelby, also known as Teacup. I can tell Teacup is in a mood tonight, so stay tuned, I guess.
And we are coming in on a close to our Elven series. I know this is one of the last topics we have to talk about. I think we have a couple, maybe character deep dive to do.
Yeah, this is our last episode scheduled for this season. We may tack on an extra thing at the end. Who knows? But yeah, next week we're going to be starting season 8, which is crazy. Well, anyway, so let's get into today's topic, which is this is kind of like a really meta topic. It's kind of ethereal almost. It's hard to conceptualize because we've never actually seen it. We just have heard about it. And that is the topic of Uthenera. So I have some fun facts about it. But before we get into those fun facts, do you have any thoughts, questions, or comments to add?
I don't think so. I think I'm in that large population of people. I don't really know a lot about what this is, but based on the little that I do know, I do have some comparisons to a real world religion and a concept that I want to bring up.
All right, first things first, let's get into some fun facts. So I think that when we think about Uthenera, I think a lot of the fandom automatically thinks of Solus, which is understandable. But I also think that there is a misconception out there that Uthenera is a new thing in Inquisition, or that Solus really originates with our knowledge of it. But it's actually mentioned or discussed in all 3 games, meaning that it is not a new lore tidbit, even though Solus does give us some new information about it. It is, something that goes back to Origins.
Yeah, so it's not like this thing that Inquisition created has been there, just probably a little expanded upon in later material.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's important to call out, because I think a lot of the criticisms of Inquisition are that it changes so much lore or goes deeper into lore, and that is not really the case in this situation. So my next fun fact is that the ancient elves are not the only ones in Dragon Age lore to have an eternal sleep. As you may know, the old gods slumber underground in the deep roads, and according to the Silent Grove comic, dragons rest for ages in the Hall of Sleepers. So there is this connection, which Austin probably wants to theorize about, but there is this connection between the old gods, the ancient dragons, and the elves, especially the elven gods here.
But the idea of eternal beings or immortal beings having to go through this long sleep or something like that is not a new thing. I mean, even the dwarfs, if I remember correctly, they don't believe that the Titans are dead. They believe that they are slumbering beneath the earth.
I'm a little bit rusty on my dwarven lore. But yeah, I'm not sure on that one. We do have at least two elves that we can meet in game who have awoken from Uthenera and then appeared, and those are Solus and Abelos. Abelos is the kind of like lead elf that you meet at the Temple of Mythal, and then Solus is, well, Solus. So yeah, those are all my fun facts. So let's talk about what even is Uthenera. What does the word mean? And yeah, just we have lots of questions about it. So, to sum it up shortly, Uthenera is a prolonged sleep that was practiced by ancient elves. The word itself has a few different translations and a few different meanings. Some of these include immortal, long sleep, or endless dream. So there are a few different ways we can translate it, but I mean, those three words, especially like long sleep, endless dream, like it's pretty self-explanatory. It's a period of immortal, unending sleep. So, before we get into like Elvenon and in Dalish mythology, we do have a few different poems in universe that are about Uthenera. And so I wanted to kind of talk about those. One is recited by an elf named Pyvel, who is part of Clan Sabre, and the other one is it's kind of recited piecemeal by two different people, and that would be Liliana in Origins and by Meryl in DA2 when she summons Mythal. So let's get into Pyvel's poem first. So I'll just read it, and then you can kind of tell me if you have any thoughts, any analysis you want to share, etc. So this is how the poem goes. Swiftly do stars burn a path across the sky, hastening to place one last kiss upon your eye. Tenderly land enfolds you in slumber, softening the rolling thunder. Dagger now sheathed, bow no longer tense. During this, your last hour, only silence.
It's very interesting, like the idea of Uthenera, this like sleep, when like in Dalish lore, in other Evaneris lore, like the journey to death is like an active journey, like that you take and that you're guided by Falindin until you get to rest. And so I feel like Uthenera is described almost as like in conflict with death, like it's holding off death.
That's interesting. I'm not sure I agree with it because I see it more as like, and this poem kind of really emphasizes this because there's so much to do with the land, the thunder, and the land enfolds you in slumber, and then the softening of the rolling thunder. There's several different references to the actual physical land of Thedas, and so I feel like there's this implication that when an elder elf goes into Uthenera, that it almost is a returning to the land, returning to what you were before you were an elf walking the earth. And so to me, that's more of how I interpret it rather than like it's not a shameful thing to go into Uthenera. It's not a bad thing. You're not weak if you have to go into it. So I guess that's how I interpret it, at least.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense too. I think with something like this, a lot of people talking about Uthenera, but we don't know a lot about actual Uthenera.
I would say I agree with that for sure. So let's talk about the second poem, which is actually from the In Uthenera Codex entry. And so Liliana will recite the poem after completing the Nature of the Beast questline, and then Mythal will recite part of it when she summons Mythal in Dragon Age 2, as I mentioned previously. So this is what this one says. Elder, your time has come. Now I'm filled with sorrow. Weary eyes need resting. Heart has become gray and slow. In waking sleep is freedom. We sing, we rejoice, we tell the tales, we laugh and cry, we love one more day.
It's interesting that Liliana recites this after you complete the Nature of the Beast. Does she recite it no matter what? Is it conditional on a certain ending?
Are these rhetorical questions, or do you expect me to have an answer?
Well, I was curious if you did have an answer. It's okay if you don't.
I don't
mean, that's
know.
um,
I do not know.
but it's interesting that she recites this with Uthenera in a quest that revolves around the elves thinking that one of their own has rediscovered the secret to immortality.
Mm-hmm.
And just the sleep. And again, like, no matter what happens in the nature of the beast quest line, something or someone comes to an end. Whether it's Witherfang, whether it is Zathrian, whether it's both of them. Like, so there is this connection of sleep and death. And like sleep and death is a connection across the world in religions and cultures. There is a connection between sleep and death. But what I think is interesting is that Meryl recites this as she summons Mythal, which we know, like, based on what we know, is that when Mythal meets Hawk, Mythal basically, or Flemeth, hides a piece of her away in like an amulet. And so it's interesting to me that she recites part of this poem to summon Flemethal out of that amulet. So now that makes me wonder, is like transferring into that item part of Uthenera, and then on top of that, if you in Origins kill Flemeth and she survives, that kind of leans to the idea that Uthenera stays off death.
Well, we'll get into that a little bit later, but also there's no if. Like, when you go to fight Mythal, like, you do kill her and she does just come back. But this situation, Mythal reciting, or Meryl reciting this when she summons Mythal, makes me wonder if, like, is she going, when Flemeth dies, air quotes, is she going into Uthenera before being resurrected, so to speak? Because I feel like that's what this implies.
I think I agree with you. And I think it is a point of the writers of Dragon Age trying to, like, oh crap, you know what? Like, we're making this other game and this person of Flemeth needs to, like, be more important. Yet we gave players the option to kill her. So how are we going to explain this?
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Well, unless you have any other thoughts about this specific poem, we can kind of move on.
Go ahead.
Okay. So before we get into what Uthenera looked like in Elvenon, I just want to jump back a little bit in history, similar to what we did last time, because I want to remind us how the elves were seen by the original Tevinter settlers. And this is because, you know, obviously the Tevinter settlers are human and the elves are not human. Obviously they're elves, but the humans, they are mortal creatures, whereas the elves, they have significantly longer lifespans. And so the elves basically functionally by Tevinter, even though they could and did die, the Tevinters saw the elves as completely immortal beings. Actually, you know, both the Tevinters and the elves themselves told stories that the elves, they neither aged nor died from natural causes. We know outside of this that that's not true. They did and they could die for completely mundane reasons. They fell in battle all the time. Like, you know, they did die. They were not completely invulnerable. However, because of these stories, because of their experiences, the Tevinters really did believe that they were immortal. But we know that many elves, when they reached a certain age, when they felt that they had lived long enough, they would enter Uthenera instead. And I have a quote from the Arlathan Part 1 Codex that I wanted to read that gives us a little bit of insight into Elven life pre-human invasion and just what that looked like. And so, and specifically at the end, it talks about when Uthenera was used and why. And so this codex says this: before the ages were named or numbered, our people were glorious and eternal and never changing. Like the great oak tree, they were constant in their traditions, strong in their roots, and ever reaching for the sky. They felt no need to rush when life was endless. They worshiped their gods for months at a time. Decisions came after decades of debate, and an introduction could last for years. From time to time, our ancestors would drift into a centuries-long slumber. End quote. And so that centuries-long slumber is obviously referring to Uthenera, but the things I want to call out is before the ages were named or numbered, before humans were even on Thedas. That's what the context of this is. The elves were, to me, I read this as much more traditional fantasy elves. Think more like Tolkien elves. They lived for a really long time. They didn't do anything in a rush. Everything was talked to death because they had the time and the luxury to do that. And it's only when, quote, from time to time, our ancestors would drift into a centuries-long slumber. So to me, the thing I want to call out, and this is the most important thing, is it says from time to time, which suggests to me that Uthenera was rare. I think there is a tendency for us to think that all elves, once they reached a certain age, went into Uthenera, but that is not true. This codex entry suggests that Uthenera was limited to a select few group of people.
Or even just like, not just a select few people, but like was not something that they just did willy-nilly. It was done in either times of necessity or...
Yeah, I think that it does absolutely imply that this was something that was done with great consideration put behind it. It wasn't something you just decided on a whim, okay, it's my time. This was something that would have been planned and prepared for. And, speaking of that, the lore even further explains that, like, the principal reason for an elf entering Uthenera was because they eventually became, quote, weary of life and basically of bearing the weight of life's memories. And that makes sense because they lived for so long. And so when they did choose to enter Uthenera, they basically would just enter like a trance-like or sleep-like state, which was then entering Uthenera. So that's how it happened and why it happened. I think we can take a mid-break now, and kind of when we come back, we can discuss the details about, who, what, when, where, all of that fun stuff, or at least what we know so far. So I guess I'll turn it over to you for the mid-break.
All right.
So you like to read? What's wrong with that?
It's frivolous. There are more important things for me to do.
That's just her favorite.
Nobody asked you to winter.
I couldn't finish the last one you lent me. I actually feel dumber for having tried.
It's literature. Smutty literature. Whatever you do, don't tell Varric.
No offense, but might I try? I've got a quick hand, after all. Let's see. When was the last time I slipped my hand into some dark hole? I remember. Long story, that.
You hurt my head sometimes, Solus.
Yes. I have been known to do that.
Welcome to the middle of the show where we talk about things going on with the podcast, and we take time to thank our patrons. Thank you to our first patrons, Lisa M. and Genesis. Also, thank you to a new patron, new this year, to the Mimi Control. Thank you so much for signing on to Patreon. If you'd like to sign on Patreon, do so at patreon.com/DALorecast. Another great way to support us is to leave us ratings and reviews on Apple or Spotify. If you leave us 5 stars and some kind words, we'll read it out on a future episode of the show. And so today I have a comment from the Finharel Part 2 episode, and this comes from Lewis W. And just says, great patience comes with a great reward. Well done. I'm glad you enjoyed the Finharel episode. We had a fun time recording both of those episodes. And lastly, join the Discord Get your merch at cupspodcasting.com. You can find all those links in the episode description or on our website, cupspodcasting.com. And with that, that's all I have for the mid-break.
All right, well, let's get back into it.
Abominations are always so awkward at family reunions. Have you ever seen an abomination? They are ugly.
Dorian, those words you say, what do they mean?
What, you mean like mendicant? Ultimatum?
No arse when you're mad. Pishanti Kothas. You're swearing, I know it.
Vishanta Kafas. It's Tavine, relics of the old tongue. We still use the colourful phrases.
And it means what?
Literally, you shit on my tongue.
You fear barbarians will swoop down upon you.
Yes, swooping is bad.
Okay, so let's talk about details, or at least the few details that we have. So the first thing to talk about is, where did Uthenera take place? So according to the Uthenera Codex entry, the elf that was the elder that was choosing to go under Uthenera would retire to a chamber that was both a bed and a tomb, and their immediate family, their extended family, and any friends of this elder would be there when the elf then succumbed to Uthenera. So it was very much something that was done surrounded by your people. I imagine this is just my headcanon, but I imagine it would be somewhat celebratory, but also mournful. Not quite a funeral, because the person isn't technically dying, but they are leaving consciousness, basically. And so I can imagine it's a celebration that they've lived this long, they've had this much life experience, and then also sad that you're losing them, much like it is when, we lose someone. So I think the biggest question is, if Uthenera is not death, technically, what happens to the body and what happens to the mind, soul, spirit? So let's talk about the body first. The body during Uthenera stays in the tomb bed combination chamber thing. In time, much time, obviously, the body will deteriorate physically, which means the elf really does die eventually. Now, that takes several hundred years. It takes a long time for that to happen. But in the meantime, before that really happens, the family does continue to visit the tomb, to pay their respects, visit their family member, etc. I think the bigger question that we probably have less information on is what happens to the mind, soul, spirit of the elf. And it's said that the spirits of the elder elves who go through Uthenera, they do cross the veil, and then they wander the shifting paths of the beyond with Falun Din as their guide. And then the last big part of this is, can the elves wake up from Uthenera? We've had conflicting information on this point, but I think the answer is yes. It is technically possible. However, I have a lot of caveats with that yes. So we do have evidence that some elves can and do and did wake up from Uthenera even after centuries. They would wake and share the secrets of dreams with the people. However, others never awoke, and they did eventually die a true death. It seems that the eventual decay of the physical body often occurred within varying amounts of time for different elves, and we don't know why. And then secondly, according to Fellason, there were some elves who entered Uthenera who were able to reach quote-unquote perfection, which is basically when they would draw sustenance from the Fade rather than dying. So they're kind of in this extended eternal sleep. And so when an elf reached this perfection, it was noticeable in some manner. We're not really sure how. And so the caretakers would be moved. The caretakers would move that elf into a tomb or a bed of pure white, which basically would signify the achievement that they have reached perfection. So these perfected elves it would be possible, absolutely, for them to wake back up from Uthenera. However, the elves that did not reach perfection and did die a true death, it would not be possible for them to wake back up from Uthenera. Does that make sense? I know this is a very heady intellectual topic.
That does make sense. My question that really ties up to this is like, we get conflicting information of like this practice existing in a post veil creation period, but we, from Solas's information, everything, it's obvious that he knew about this, so it's likely that this practice was pre-veil creation.
Yes, it is. This practice, it originates way back before the veil came to be. I think that when the Eveneris fell and were locked away is when things begin to change. Because if you think about it, in the modern Dragon Age, the ones that we've met who have woken up from Uthenera are ancient elves. Solus and Abelos, thank you. And so they are waking up from something that enacted many, many years ago. Modern elves are not practicing this because they don't know how. Modern elves do not have the knowledge, the lore, the manpower, frankly, to man these tombs, to work these tombs, to protect the elves inside. And I mean, there are scenes in The Masked Empire, which we'll talk about soon, but there are scenes in there where they walk through these mausoleums of elves who have been in Uthenera, and like the caretakers' bones are decaying now too. And so you can tell just how long it truly has been.
Yeah, I'm just curious about like, the reason I say that is like the effect the Fade has on this practice, and like how the effect of no veil and the Fade being and the material world being one and the same almost, like how that affects all of this and the Fade's connections to dreams. And it's just all very fascinating that I want more information on. I don't really have any like coherent thoughts.
I think the thing that I want to talk about before we get into some more discussion is I find this practice really sad, not because the practice itself is sad, but because of Solas's and, bringing up of the veil, of everything that happens with that. It makes the practice heartbreaking because you have to think about the elves who are in Uthenera when the veil goes up. They're in Uthenera, and if they make it to the other side, they wake up and they have no guide. They wake up and they have no idea where they are in the Fade because it's completely different now. And I can't imagine how disorienting and hard that would be to, have expected your God, your literal God, to be there waiting for you and to say, okay, I'm here. We're going to make it through the Fade into the beyond, and to wake up in the Fade and not have that. Like, can you imagine how difficult that would be?
I do think that's very sad. I wonder what happened if someone woke up from Uthenera and like realized, like came back and realized that, oh crap, like the entire world's different. Where's our people? Like Solus. Solus is a great example of that. I know we're going to talk about the Dalish and like what the Dalish believe about a lot of stuff. And so I want to let you get through all of that before I talk about this. But just a spoiler, like I think the quickening is going to have a big effect on this. And I am excited to talk about it.
Before we move on to the Dalish, I want to talk about class really quickly because this piece is really important for us to mention. And so you have to understand that, again, Uthenera is rare. Not every elf got to do it. And according to Felasan in the Masked Empire, the elves that were in Uthenera were tended by servants. And he doesn't say who pays for those servants. He doesn't really give us any more information other than the fact that they were tended by servants. And also he doesn't give us information if this includes the like decaying bodies that were experiencing the true death or just the bodies that are still quote unquote alive. We don't know. But you have to think about who's paying for these servants, right? Like, there's no way that these elven servants would just go and work and take care of these dead and dying bodies for free. So someone has to pay for it. So let me talk about what these servants did, and then we can kind of discuss who has access. So, the servants would bathe the elf that is in Uthenera in scented oils. They would light candles, all kinds of things like that. And they did all of this in order to, quote, provide them with a spark of wisdom on their journey. They would also then administer a potion of water, honey, and herbs that is specifically for mages. So they had several different responsibilities. And we're not really sure. I'm sure there's other things that they did as well. This is just what we do have information on. And so it really brings up the point of like, one reason why Uthenera was rare is because only a certain amount of people have the funds to be able to afford this indefinitely for centuries. I would imagine most elves could not afford this, especially not, elves who are the slaves of the Evenuris. This is something that like is going to be the high priest of the Temple of Mythal. Like, those are the kind of elves that are going to be able to afford this, not your regular everyday like baker or artisan or merchant, not your everyday person. It's going to be the 1% that are able to afford this.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And just to kind of add on to that, so like, this is very reminiscent of like other ancient practices around caring for a dead body. I know Uthenera isn't death, but even in stories like the biblical stories where they would take, herbs and all kinds of stuff to go and prepare the body, the whole ancient Egyptian process of embalmment and all of that kind of going in mummification, there were people that were like under the charge of whatever god or religious service who were responsible for that. But there was still like a fee that had to be paid. And like, even in Egyptian, like not every Egyptian was buried in this lavish tomb with all of their earthly possessions. Like, that was a nobility thing. And similar here, it seems like this would be some type of nobility, or I really feel like Elvenon was a, theocracy with the religious leaders in charge of everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I very much agree with that. And I think the comparison to ancient Egypt is very apt in this situation because it's very similar. Like, this is kings, queens. These are exceptions, not the rule. So,
Exactly.
Okay, let's talk about the Dalish really quickly. There's not a lot here to talk about with the Dalish, obviously. But basically, the Dalish believe that Uthenera fell out of practice because the elves came into contact with humans, which then shortened their lifespans. The Uthenera Codex actually says, quote, "With the arrival of humans and the quickening of elven blood that ensued, the practice of Uthenera began to fade. When Arlathan fell, it ceased forever." However, we know, in truth, the elves lost their immortality because the veil was created. Still, though, elders would come to slumber, even to the places that were built by humans, such as places like the Brazilian ruins in Ferelden, and visitors did offer tribute to those gods on their behalf. So the Dalish ritual was performed. Basically, an elf was laid to rest. It involved a collective prayer at an altar, and then a robed figure would pour water into a pool while standing waist deep in it. So this differs quite strongly from the ancient practice of Uthenera, which again tracks with everything we've discussed about the Dalish so far in this season. And so the last kind of thing I want to talk about is just that when the Tevinter Imperium waged war on the elves, many of them believed that they were bound by duty to defend the ones who remained in Uthenera. That's why elven elders came to sleep at Sundermount in the Vimark Mountains. Arcane warriors made their last stand there and perished in a great battle with humans, which is why a lot of elves are attracted to that area, which we see in Dragon Age 2. So that's about all I have on Uthenera, but I know Austin has things and thoughts that he wants to mention, so I'm going to turn it over to him.
I think we like to picture Uthenera stopping just because like the elves are falling and they're losing a connection to their culture. And I think that's true. And I also think that there is something of like the practice of Uthenera falling out because it's no longer practical. It's no longer something they can sustain. And what I was thinking about, like these Uthenera elves who make it to the other side and they can't find their god and they're lost. I was thinking about what if, like, imagine going to sleep into this Uthenera when you're 20 and then waking up with the body of an 80-year-old because of the quickening of elven blood, and you have now aged quicker than you expected, and the trauma of that. And I just think that as the quickening came, the journey was no longer effective with Uthenera. Like they couldn't physically sustain their bodies long enough to do the journey of Uthenera. And so more people just started succumbing to true death. And so the practice fell out.
Right. But also, like, there would be no reason to do it because the whole purpose that they did this is because once the elves reached a certain amount of years, they became weary of life, weary of living, weary of the memories, weary of, the people that surrounded them. And so when you're only living for 70 years, you're not going to reach that as much as you would when you're used to living for 500 years. So there's just not really a reason for it anymore because of that.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I'm also reminded of just a funny little tidbit from the inheritance cycle of the dragons who are also immortal when they live to be so huge and so old, like thousands upon thousands of years old. They literally cannot stay awake because of the energy it takes to keep their body awake. And they spend most of their time in dreams and communicate basically through memories. So basically they are living their entire life within their memories and their dreams. And that's how they exist because they've existed for so long, and the energy it takes to keep their body awake and moving is just too great. And that Uthenera reminded me of that, of like the elder elves who had lived so long that they had wanted to do that. And then lastly was a question of with Abelos and the other ancient elves. I sometimes wonder if in the fall of Arlathan and all of the stuff that with the fallout of Solus and the betrayal of Evnuris, the creation of the Veil, if there were a lot of elves who entered Uthenera before they should have, like in an attempt to protect what was there and prolong the elven people. Similar, I'm thinking of the Protheans when they enter the pods to try to say, oh, we'll wake up later when the Reapers are gone.
I don't think we know of that happening. However, just because I'm not aware of it doesn't mean it's impossible. And also, we may get evidence of that in the future.
All right, so the last thing is a comparison with a real-world religion in Judaism, which is the concept. This really reminds me of what the concept of Sheol is, which is an early Jewish, ancient Israel, ancient Hebrew concept of afterlife in a little bit. It's not really afterlife, but it kind of is afterlife. And basically what it is like the ancient practice believed that the spirits of the dead or souls of the dead or whatever laid under the earth in sleep. And that was what happened after death, is that you were laying under the earth in Sheol in the great sleep. That's a lot of times in the Bible, you'll see like taking the sleep of death. Like that's in a reference to Sheol and all of this. And so I really think there's a lot of comparison here. And we've already seen some comparison with Jewish people in the elves already. So I doubt that they're comparison, like their writers are intentional just because of how obscure this would be. But I do think it's interesting as a comparison.
Yeah, I do think that's an interesting comparison. And I feel like it's entirely possible that the writers studied a lot of different religions when they were coming up with this idea, because it is reminiscent of like just the afterlife in general in a lot of different theologies. So I think that would make sense. Now, do you have anything else before we transition to our side character for a hot minute?
I think that's all I had to say about Uthenera, other than I do think it's fascinating and I am excited to potentially learn more, maybe. But that's all I really have to say on the matter.
All right, well, let's get into our side character. This one's going to be pretty quick because we don't know a ton about this person. But today's side character is Lanaya, who is an elf that you can meet in Dragon Age Origins with the quest with the Dalish. And so she is the first under Keeper Zathrian. And obviously, depending on your choices in the game, she might even become the Keeper by the end of Origins. So to get into her backstory a little bit, when she was young, her parents worked for a human merchant when one day their caravan was attacked by bandits who then killed her parents. She was forced into slavery under these bandits. And when they made camp near the Dalish travel route, the bandits killed one of the Dalish scouts. Zathrian then discovered this, tracked down the murderous bandits, and slaughtered them all. He then took pity on the poor elven slave, Lanaya, who he then took back to the clan where she remained and rose through the ranks to eventually become his first. However, this journey proved difficult as she was not born into the clan and she was looked upon with skepticism, to put it lightly. But eventually she proved herself to be competent and hardworking, and the clan's prejudice fell away in time. Zathrian looked fondly upon Lanaya, saying that she was, quote, more than ready to become Keeper. You can talk with her, and she will tell you about herself, Keepers in general, Zathrian, and basically will just talk with you about any of the actions you take in camp. And then lastly, if Zathrian dies, Lanaya will become the Keeper and help the clan develop a more positive role with the nearby humans, especially after they show up to help during the Battle of Denerim. As expected, conflicts do occasionally rise between the humans and elves, but Lanaya is able to help keep the peace. So, Austin, do you have thoughts about this character?
I really find it interesting, these elves who at one point were city elves, and then became Dalish elves. I think that's really interesting. Just because I would be interested to talk about them and their transition, even though Linnea would have been pretty young when all that happened. So I doubt she would have very much information about that. But I don't have a big memory of her from the game, just because it's been a long time since I have played Origins where I talk to everybody. But I do think that she does present this opposition to Zathrian of this okay, I'm gonna be level-headed, no, we don't have to murder everybody, let's chill out, have a Kit Kat, stop murdering people, this kind of vibe.
Yeah, I agree with that. She very much is this more logical, level-headed, even-keeled. She's not quite as given into her emotions as Zathrian is.
So yeah, I really like that. I want more diversity in elven people. I want different elves. And I think we do get a good portion of that in the game, but I feel like our companions are the ones who are different, and then every other NPC is copy and paste. I'm a Dalish elf. I hate humans.
I think that's probably a fair criticism. I am hopeful that we'll get different and new things coming up, but yeah, we'll see.
All right. Well, then we can move on. And thank you for bringing all of this here to us and about Uthenera, this very interesting topic. I was glad to talk about all of that. And thank you, Shelby. Thank you to the listeners for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We will see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. You can find us on Twitter at DA Lorecast.
If you have any lore questions, topics to unpack, or side character suggestions, join our Cups Podcasting and More Discord server. It's easily the best place on the internet. You can also support us financially through our Patreon. You can find us there on patreon.com/DragonAgeLorecast.
The Dragon Age Lorecast is part of the Robots Radio Network. For more information about the Robots Radio Network, join the Discord server via the link in our episode description.
If you enjoyed the show or learned something new today, please subscribe, leave us a review, and join the Patreon. And if you enjoyed our intro and outro music, give a big thank you to Pipeman Studios. Thank you, Pipeman. Thanks again for listening to the Dragon Age Lorecast. We'll see you next time.
Are you a fan of Elden Ring? Are you confused about the lore as pretty much everyone else? We've got you covered. Check out the Elden Archives, a lore podcast that helps to explain every little confusing detail about the lands between. Things like what exactly happened on the Night of the Black Knives, or what we really know about characters like Mikola. Just like the show you're listening to now, we're on the Robots Radio Network, so you know it'll be good. Wondering how to find the show? Easy. Either go to robotsradio.net or search Elden Archives on whatever podcatcher you're using right now. Bookmark the show for later, and we'll see you in the lands between. Again, that's the Elden Archives, a FromSoft Lorecast available everywhere.